What if one of the most powerful forces in astrology is dying? Because according to astrologer John Michael Greer, Pluto, the planet of hidden power, oligarchy, and control, is losing its potency. It's losing its grip on the world. And if that's true, then everything we think we know about who runs the world and how they exercise their power is about to change. In this video, we're going to explore Greer's ideas and their implication. And we're going to see how the work of another astrologer, who you've seen on this channel before, seems to confirm that Greer's intuitions about Pluto could be right. This is World Astrology Report. I'm your host, Dan Waites, and welcome to another journey into the past to understand the present and the future. Pluto is named for the god of the underworld, and so it governs the hidden and sometimes unseemly truths that undergird reality. It's the planet of psychoanalysis, organized crime, and conspiracy, but it's also the planet of power. It was discovered in 1930, around the time that scientists were unraveling the secrets of the atom, which eventually led to the building of the nuclear bomb. At the core of each atom is a nucleus, and when it's split, energy is released. Thus, while Pluto can be said to govern power in general, it speaks in particular to power that's held by small groups of people. It's the planet of cabals, cartels, secret societies, and oligarchy. If you look to history, what you tend to find is that, generally speaking, great changes, great events are actually driven by very small numbers of people. What appear to be spontaneous uprisings, for example, times when people take to the streets in huge numbers, are usually planned and organized and driven by a small revolutionary core. That's Pluto at work. And Pluto tends to operate through secrecy. Pluto is the Roman equivalent of the Greek Hades, who, according to the myths, possessed a cap of invisibility, sometimes called the Helm of Darkness, which made its wearer invisible. Thus, Plutonian power tends to be exercised in secret, although its effects can be vast in scope and very visible. What you inevitably find in this world is that power is held by small numbers of people. Humans tend to be ruled by oligarchies, small numbers of powerful individuals and families who usually know each other. This tends to be as true in modern democracies as it is in collectivist states. Again, power is Plutonian in the sense that it tends to be held by a small nucleus of people. And it's tempting to think that that's always how it's been and how it will be. But I recently read a book by the magician, druid, writer, and astrologer John Michael Greer called The Twilight of Pluto. Greer has an intriguing thesis about Pluto, one that, if true, could have huge implications for events in the world over the next 10 years. If you're enjoying this video so far, then please do click the like button down there, subscribe to the channel, and even, if you so desire, enable notifications. All of that stuff really helps my channel, and I appreciate it. And one other thing, my friend Aswin Subramanian is a brilliant Vedic astrologer coming from a 300-year lineage of Indian astrologers. He's launching his third cohort for his one-year diploma in Indian astrology course, which starts in June this year. Viewers of this channel can get a discount off the normal price of $100 using the coupon code DAN719. If you've ever wanted to study Vedic astrology, then this is your chance. Find the link to the course in the description below. All right, onwards. The thesis of Greer's book hinges on an event that took place on August the 26th of 2006, when members of the International Astronomical Union took an historic and controversial decision. They voted to change Pluto's status, demoting it from a planet to a dwarf planet. Since its discovery in 1930, Pluto was considered the 9th planet of our solar system. In the early 2000s, astronomers started to discover all sorts of planet-like objects that shared the Kuiper belt of Pluto. Bodies like Eris, Quaoar, Sedna, Haumea, and Makemake. Eris, named for the goddess of discord, is actually larger than Pluto, which is just 1/400th the size of Earth, and it's even smaller than our moon. What's more, the other planets in the solar system are massive enough to have cleared the space they move through of smaller objects. But that's not true of Pluto. And so the astronomers took the decision that day in 2006 to reclassify Pluto as a dwarf planet, putting it into the same category as objects like Ceres and Eris and the various other new discoveries. Now, here's where this gets interesting. Greer argues that Pluto's demotion was a meaningful event, not only from an astronomical perspective, but from an astrological one too. He argues that this event signified the disempowerment of Pluto, and that after around the year 2036, it will be a significantly less potent astrological force. To be clear, he doesn't say it won't do anything anymore. He just thinks its power will be more on the level of other dwarf planets like Ceres rather than a fully fledged planet. Now, I'm guessing that some of you, particularly the astrologers among you, are reacting to this the same way that I did when I first heard this idea, and thinking that a bunch of astronomers don't have the ability to take a planet's power away like that. But actually, that's not quite what Greer is saying. He's not saying that the IAU demotion of Pluto took away its power. It's kind of the other way around. The actions of the IAU were driven by cosmic changes that they were unconsciously responding to. Greer puts it like this, quote, "Every event that takes place on Earth mirrors and is mirrored by changes in the heavens. The decisions of an astronomical organization are not exempt from that law. The decision that assigned Pluto a new status, the meeting at which it took place, and the actions of each of the astronomers present in Prague that day were all part of the fabric of the universe, shaped by intersecting patterns of influence that can also be read in the heavens by those who know how to do so." Now, I said earlier that Greer believes Pluto will have lost a lot of its power by 2036. But why that year in particular? Well, 2036 is 30 years after 2006, when Pluto was demoted. And 30 years is, roughly speaking, one Saturn cycle. And Saturn is a planet of time itself. Think of old Father Time. Greer suggests that a new planet's influence starts to be felt about one Saturn cycle before its discovery, and it fades away by about one Saturn cycle following its demotion. But is that really true? Well, let's take a look at the historical record. On March the 13th of 1781, the astronomer William Herschel discovered Uranus. This was a truly historic moment by anyone's reckoning, because this was the first discovery of a new planet beyond the 5 known by the ancients. Uranus is the planet astrologers have come to associate with surprising and shocking events, revolution, revelation, eccentricity, freedom, and connection to the higher self. And so its surprising entry into the planetary pantheon fits its nature. What's more, its discovery in 1781 coincided with a truly revolutionary period in history. It was the period of the American and French revolutions. But it was also a time when new technologies were transforming the world, because this was the period of the first industrial revolution. Astrologers have noticed that a planet's nature tends to accord with the things happening in the world at the time of its discovery. The astrologer Richard Tarnas has argued that Uranus, the planet of invention and new technology, would more appropriately be named after Prometheus, the titan who stole the fire of the gods and gave it to humanity. But Greer points out that Uranus's influence had already begun to be felt years before its discovery. For example, the American Revolution began in 1775, and it had its origins much earlier. And James Watt's steam engine, which drove the Industrial Revolution, was invented in 1765. Now, in the case of Neptune, which was discovered in 1846, we see something similar. Neptune is the planet of unity. It signifies the dissolution of the self. It represents the ideal, the imagination, illusions, delusions, and all those things that serve to unite people collectively. Neptune's discovery came close to the time of Europe's 1848 revolutions. Now you might say, well, I thought Uranus was the planet of revolution. But Greer points out that those 1848 revolutions were disorganized and spontaneous, with goals that were little more than empty slogans. And so they had much more of a Neptunian character than the focused and effective Uranian revolutions of the late 18th century. As a collectivist influence, Neptune is typically associated with communism. And lo and behold, Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto was published in 1848, very close to the time that Neptune was discovered. But Marx and Engels, contrary to what a lot of people think, didn't actually invent communism. Greer points out that communist ideology had actually been spreading across Europe since the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, which is roughly one Saturn cycle before Neptune's discovery. Now, Greer also points to other examples of celestial bodies that spent some time as planets before being demoted, either because they weren't large enough or because it turned out that they didn't actually exist. His best example is Ceres, which was discovered in 1801, and was initially considered to be a new planet, but it was demoted to the status of asteroid from around 1850 onwards. Ceres is named for the Roman goddess of agriculture, grains, fertility, and maternal love. She's the equivalent of the Greek Demeter. In astrology, she represents nourishment and nurture. She can show you how you relate to those themes and to food in particular. According to Greer's theory, the Ceres era lasted from about 1770 to 1880. Interestingly, he argues that the Romantic art movement is the main signature of the Ceres era. The Romantics opposed the Uranian Industrial Revolution, seeking artistic inspiration from nature, the earth, folk tales, deep history, and community. Romanticism got going around 1770, about one Saturn cycle before Ceres was discovered. It peaked between 1800 and 1850, the period when Ceres was considered a planet, and it began to fade away from there. Greer also cites two other examples of planets that come in and out of planetary status, Vulcan and Lilith, both because it turned out that they didn't actually exist. Vulcan, for example, was a theorized planet that was believed to orbit the Sun closer than Mercury. It was thought to exist between about 1860 and 1915, when its existence was disproved. Vulcan was the blacksmith and technologist of the gods. Greer points out that the period of 1830 to 1945 was, quote, the greatest era of technological innovation in human history, the period during which most of the technologies that define modern life were first invented and put to work. Now, let's assume for now that Greer's theory about temporary planets is right. What would it mean for Pluto to be demoted? Greer has an interesting delineation of the true meaning of Pluto. He says that fundamentally it represents what he calls opposition to cosmos. He says this, quote, the ancient Greek concept of cosmos, literally that which is beautifully ordered, lies at the heart not only of astrology, but of most of the world's traditions of spiritual philosophy and practice. The vision of the universe as a beautifully ordered whole, in which anything that affects one part affects all parts, in which everything has a place and nothing ever goes away, pervades the higher possibilities of human consciousness and is reflected in a great many mystical, religious, and occult traditions from around the world. During the Plutonian era, that vision was in eclipse. And so for Greer, the Plutonian era constituted a time in which humanity lost its respect for the natural beauty and order of the cosmos, worked to violate it, to dominate it, to subordinate nature to capricious human will. He writes this, from an astrological standpoint, it is anything but accidental that the Second World War, the deadliest war in recorded human history, took place in Pluto's heyday, or that the worst mass murders in human history, the gargantuan genocides in communist China, the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and Khmer Rouge Cambodia, all took place in the years between Pluto's discovery and its demotion. Nor did the sexual revolution of the 20th century and the resulting transformation of popular entertainment during that century into a vast carnival of sex and death come as any surprise to those who were paying attention to planetary influences. There's a planet of sex and death, of explosive subterranean impulses bursting free of all restraint. Pluto presided over all these transformations. Greer also associates certain very specific trends and technologies with the Plutonian era, including nuclear technology, Freudian psychoanalysis, space travel, modern art, and communism. He argues that all of these things will ultimately turn out to have been failed experiments, things that will be left behind once the Plutonian era is finished. So to recap, Greer's thesis is that the Plutonian era will end up spanning from 1900, about 30 years before its discovery in 1930, to 2036, 30 years after its demotion in 2006. Let's have a look at some of those things that Greer thinks are going to fade away. First of all, nuclear fission. Radioactivity was discovered in 1898, just over 30 years before the discovery of Pluto. Einstein published his famous equation E=mc² in 1901. Not long after Pluto's discovery in 1930 came the invention of nuclear fission in 1942, and then the building and use of nuclear weapons in 1945. But Greer argues that both nuclear weapons and nuclear power, more generally, have been failures. Nuclear weapons are so powerful that they couldn't really be used, and nuclear accidents like 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima undermined confidence in the safety of nuclear fission. He also points out that nobody's been able to make nuclear fusion technology work yet either. Another phenomenon Greer associates with Pluto is space travel. He points out that the first realistic discussion of spaceflight technology was published in 1903, just under 30 years before Pluto was discovered. Similarly to nuclear power, space travel has ended up being a disappointment. Despite the hopes of 20th century science fiction and the apparent promise of the early days of space exploration, space travel hasn't really delivered. One reason for that is the intense radiation in space, which Earth's magnetosphere protects us from. but which makes space travel very costly for humans. And interestingly, Elon Musk recently abandoned his plans to colonize Mars in favor of a mission to the moon. Another phenomenon Greer associates with Pluto is communism, which he suggests is another failed experiment, citing the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 and China's abandonment of Marxist economic theory in favor of state capitalism. He also suggests that psychoanalysis has been a disappointment too. After all, not many people are in Freudian analysis these days. Now, to be clear, I'm not sure I totally agree with Greer on all aspects of his thesis. Of course, he's a very accomplished astrologer and magician who's earned the right to be taken seriously on such matters. But I do have some quibbles with the theory. Firstly, I'm not sure we have enough good examples of celestial bodies gaining and losing planetary status to draw really firm conclusions about what it will mean in the case of Pluto. And another is in my own work, I've done a lot of study of history through the lens of the Synodic cycles of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto going back thousands of years. And I'm absolutely certain that those cycles were working in a very meaningful fashion for millennia before those planets were discovered, including Pluto. Greer doesn't really address this in the book, so I'm not sure what he'd say about it. I personally believe that the impulses represented by Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto were always with us at some level, but their discovery has heightened and exaggerated their influences in order that humanity could become conscious of the principles that they represent. For example, society today is far more Uranian than it was before Uranus's discovery. We're constantly seeing new discoveries, new technologies and ideas. Society is changing much faster today than it used to before the Industrial Revolution. Similarly, modern technology has enabled human consciousness to collectivize and universalize in line with the principle represented by Neptune. Generally speaking, human lives tended to be much more siloed in the past, where we used to be concerned with village life and not much beyond that. Today, we live in the global village, one in which, like it or not, we're concerned with humanity as a whole, as a unified and interconnected collective. But what about Pluto? Could it be that Greer is right, that we're currently in a Plutonian era, but that the societal tendencies that Pluto represents are about to be disempowered? Well, here's where I think all this gets really interesting, because the work of another astrologer seems to validate Greer's thesis, but from a very different perspective. The astrologer Rosie Finn appeared on this channel in this episode. She's done a ton of research into the cycle of Pluto going back thousands of years, which she laid out in her book Persephone's Revolution. In particular, she's noted that during Pluto's 248-year cycle, there are two periods during which its effects seem to be much more powerful than usual. And those periods are times when Pluto moves into the state astrologers call out of bounds. A planet goes out of bounds when its declination exceeds the sun's maximum or minimum declination, which is essentially a measure of its angular distance north or south of the celestial equator. The sun's declination ranges between plus 23.45 degrees, which it reaches on the summer solstice, and minus 23.45 degrees, which it reaches at the winter solstice. Now, because the planets' orbits aren't perfectly aligned with the ecliptic, their declination can exceed plus or minus 23.45 degrees. And when they do that, they're considered to be out of bounds. Astrologers interpret this to mean that the planet acts in an exaggerated or extreme way, as if the normal rules or bounds to its behavior no longer apply. Now, Pluto usually goes out of bounds at 2 points during its cycle, very roughly speaking, times when it's in Leo or Aquarius. When it goes out of bounds to the north, it's usually in the sun's sign of Leo. Rosie's identified these as times when tyrants and empires tend to rise. Genghis Khan, Julius Caesar, Louis XIV, and Adolf Hitler all waged war during these periods. The last time Pluto was going out of bounds to the north was between 1938 and 1953, time of the Second World War and the totalitarian rule of Hitler and Joseph Stalin. When Pluto goes out of bounds to the south, when it's usually in Aquarius, Rosie found that the world tended to see revolutions and collapse as the internal contradictions of systems and empires caused either their reform or implosion. The last time this happened was the late 18th century, the time of the French and American revolutions. The time before that came the Protestant Reformation. Now, Pluto is going to go out of bounds every year between 2025 and 2035. So we're in one of those periods once again. And I think it's fair to say that the times feel pre-revolutionary. And here's the fascinating thing. Due to the same phenomenon that produces the precession of the equinoxes, Pluto is not going to go out of bounds again for thousands of years. So a particular Plutonian pattern of history, one that's coincided with titanic power struggles over and over again, is about to end. And I think this is very interesting in light of John Michael Greer's work. Greer sees the demotion of Pluto as signifying a demotion of the principles it represents, notably opposition to cosmos, and the idea that man can run roughshod over nature and his fellows in pursuit of power. And he sees 2036 as the end of the Plutonian Era. And Rosie Finn's research suggests there's something special about the period between now and 2035 that marks the last time that we'll see a particular dynamic involving the Plutonian theme of power. And so my hunch is that Rosie Finn may have identified the technical factor that actually underlies John Michael Greer's more omen-based reading of what's coming. And so what all this suggests to me is that this period of the next 10 years or so will bring a fundamental shift in the way human history unfolds and how power is exercised. Now, before we go, I'm going to give you some of my own thoughts on what all this might mean when you put it together. John Michael Greer says that Pluto represents the principle of opposition to cosmos. I find that an insightful definition. But as I said at the start of this video, I also see Pluto as denoting hidden power exercised by small groups of people. In other words, Pluto is the planet of conspiracy and rule by oligarchy. If you've followed my channel for a while, you'll know that I believe that the Synodic Cycle of Pluto and Neptune governs changes to the kinds of people who hold power in the world. Since those conjunctions moved from Taurus into Gemini in 1398, we've moved into an era of dominance by bankers and traders. The current cycle, which began with fresh Gemini conjunctions in 1891 and 1892, has seen a globalized era dominated by central banks and the people who control them. The reality is that despite what we're supposed to believe, we don't really live in democracies. We live in oligarchies pretending to be democracies. And our perception of the world we live in is ruthlessly and relentlessly shaped and manipulated by intelligence agencies and controlled media and so on and so forth. But people are becoming more aware than ever that this is true. Something really does seem to be changing, and people are becoming far more aware than ever before of how power actually functions in our world and who really holds it. Consider, for example, the way that the release of the Epstein files this year has confirmed a lot of the darker suspicions of conspiracy theorists. Epstein was, in essence, an intelligence agent working for old banking interests, for whom the state of Israel plays a particularly central role in their plans for the world. What people are also realizing is that political leaders serve other interests beyond those of the populations they repeatedly lie to. The idea of a political left and right is really little more than a cunning ruse, one that distracts the public from the enactment of an agenda which doesn't change whether your party or the other one is in control. In other words, things are changing, and they seem to be changing in the domain of Pluto, which, as we've seen, has to do with unseen power. The question I have is this: what happens when hidden power is brought into the light? Does it dissolve, or does it merely transform from power that works in secret to explicit, known power structures that come out into the open? John Michael Greer argues that communism was a Plutonian phenomenon, and I think we can probably broaden that delineation to totalitarianism in general. If he's right, then we could be leaving the era of totalitarianism behind. And of course, I very much hope that he is right on that. Unfortunately, though, right now, it seems to me that we're actually seeing a growing embrace of totalitarianism around the world. Freedom of speech is under attack everywhere. And digital technology is being used to construct a totalizing control grid. When linked together, technologies like AI, digital ID, and central bank digital currencies would permit states to create surveillance and control systems that would be very difficult, if not impossible, to escape from. The former banker Catherine Austin Fitts, who is one of the best informed voices of opposition to all this stuff, believes that central banks are preparing to take control of fiscal policy, which is a kind of unassuming way of saying that they're getting ready to take power, which essentially means that the oligarchy that controls institutions like the Federal Reserve is getting ready to take more direct control of our societies. And I can't help but think that the energy crisis that's starting right now as a result of the US and Israel's attack on Iran could facilitate that plan, just as COVID-19 did. So I see three possibilities here. The first is that such a globalized control system will indeed be constructed, and the forces that have worked to make that happen will come into visibility as the powers and principalities that rule the world. A second is that, as Rosie Finn's work suggests, people could rise up in rebellion against the system and either reform it or tear it down completely in the coming years. And a third scenario, which I think is perhaps most likely, is a mix of the first two possibilities. The so-called elites will indeed get their great reset, and some people will dutifully comply with its demands, but others will resist, perhaps rather quietly, and find ways to evade its rules and regulations. They might build parallel systems using decentralized technology, or simply try to opt out of technology completely. I get the sense that the powers that be are in a great rush to complete this transition for some reason that isn't entirely clear to me right now. Perhaps that reason is that, as Bibhu Dev Misra argues, the Kali Yuga just ended, and the powers that should not be are scrambling to find a way to continue stuffing their pockets with money and bellies with human flesh while they still can. Of course, this push to have the entire planet counted and accounted for and controlled by their computers smacks of hubris, the kind of arrogant and overweening attempt to defy nature that the gods love to punish. In other words, it's the Tower of Babel. I have a long live stream on this subject on my website, so if you want to watch that, sign up as a member at worldastrologyreport.com. And one final note, the Tao Te Ching explains that reversal is the movement of the Tao. And so the very nature of things is such that this grasping towards total control can only, in fact, produce its opposite, and thus it is doomed to fail. All right, that's almost it for this video. In the bonus section, we continue on this metaphysical tip and consider the demotion of Pluto from a deeper perspective. If you enjoyed this video, then I suggest you watch this one, in which we explore the phenomenon of the Great Split through an astrological lens. Thanks for watching, and see you again on the channel very soon.